Good morning, class 6 students. Last class we already discussed about the structure of flower. Next one is pollination. Pollination is the transfer of pollen grain from anther to stigma of a flower. There are two types of pollination, self-pollination and cross-pollination. So the flower contain total 4 holes. We already discussed in last class. Out of the 4 holes, the two are the main reproductive part, androecium and gynoecium. The androecium is the male reproductive part and gynoecium is the female reproductive part. The transfer of pollen grain from the anther part to the stigma part of the flower is known as pollination. The stigma part is the female reproductive part and anther is the male reproductive part. The transfer of the pollen grain produced in the anther of the male flower. The transfer of the pollen grain from anther to the stigma part of the flower is known as pollination. Pollination are of two types, self-pollination and cross-pollination. Self-pollination either occur within the flower, within the same flower, or in between two flowers of the same plant. In between two flowers of the same plant, then that type of pollination is known as self-pollination. In case of self-pollination, the pollen grain from anther fall on the stigma of either the same flower or the another flower on the same plant. But in case of cross-pollination, the pollen grain transfer from one flower to another flower which burn on different plant of the same kind. For example, a China rose flower pollen grain transfer only the China rose plant flower of different plant, so within the same species of the flower. Then next part is the agent of pollination. There are some agents which help in the pollination process. First one is butterflies. Butterflies, bees and other insects visit flower for collecting nectar. When the insect visit flower and collect nectar, the pollen grain stick the mouth part of the wings, legs, and when it visit another flower, it transfer from one flower to another flower. So when the insect visit one flower, the pollen grain attached in the leg and the sting of the insect, and when the flower visit another flower, the pollen grain transfer from one flower to the another flower, and the insect pollination occur. In case of mustard, marigold, dahlia, salvia, the insect pollination found. The insect pollinated flower are usually large in size, brightly color or attractive color, produce fragrance or scent, and also produce nectar. Then second type of pollination is known as wind pollination. Maize, palm, pine, the flower produce dry and large quantity pollen grain. When the pollen grain fully mature, it blown with the help of wind, and when it get any female flower, it attach the feathery stigma part of the female flower, and the pollination occur. That type of pollination is known as wind pollination. Third type of pollination is water pollination. The flower like Valisneria, the female flower mainly present above the water and the male flower present below the water. When the male flower fully mature, it moves upward and float on the surface of water. When it gets meet a female flower, the pollen grain transfer from one male flower to the female flower and the pollination occur. Then another type of pollination is known as pollination through animals like birds and other animals like elephant. The pollination, the pollen grain transfer through the birds and the other agent like elephant transfer pollination in case of Rafflesia flower. The next part is the fertilization. After the transfer of pollen grain, from the male flower to the female flower is known as pollination. After the pollination, then the next step occur, that is known as the fertilization. When the pollen grain meet the stigma, it germinate and produce a tube-like structure, and finally it enter into the ovary part of the flower. And inside the ovary it contain ovule. Inside the ovule it contain egg cell. The male cell, the male nucleus or the pollen grain nucleus fused with the female flower nucleus and form the zygote. The fusion of the male and female sex cell is known as the fertilization. Ovary after fertilization changes into a large develop into a fruit, and the ovule part of the flower changes into the seed. Then next one is the fruit. A fruit is a ripened ovary. After the formation of zygote or after fertilization, the ovary changes into fruit, and the ripened ovary is known as the fruit. For most people, the fruit is a sweet, fleshy, edible part. Tomato, pea, pumpkin are the fruits of the plant, though they are commonly called vegetables. Then difference between vegetables and fruits. Vegetables is any edible part of the plant like root, stem, leaf, fruit, etc. But fruits only if the ovary part changes into the fleshy part, then it is known as the fruit. Or vegetables normally were eaten either raw or cooked, but fruits always eaten in the raw form. Then apple, pear are different kinds of fruit. In this the thalamus of the flower, the thalamus region of the flower become the fleshy part of the fruit. See, this is the thalamus region of the flower, then which we eat, while the ovary remains small central part. This central part is the ovary, which is a hollow sphere like structure, and the hollow sphere part contain seeds, and this type of seeds are known as pulse. It contains seed, and the fruit is only the hollow part which covered by a layer. So this type of fruit are known as false fruit. The next one is parts of fruit. The fruit mainly contain three parts. The outer surface of the fruit or outer covering is known as epicarp. Middle edible part is known as mesocarp, and the inner part which attached with the seed or the innermost layer or innermost thin skin like layer is known as endocarp. Pericarp is the fruit wall developed from the ovary wall, and it may be thick or thin depending the kinds of the fruit. In tomato, papaya, it's soft and fleshy, while in gram it is dry. The pericarp contains three parts: epicarp, mesocarp and endocarp. So the total layer of the fruit are known as pericarp. It covered by three layers. The outermost layer is known as epicarp, middle fleshy part is known as mesocarp, and innermost part is known as endocarp. The next one is fruits are of two types: fleshy fruit and dry fruit. The fruit like papaya, tomato, cherry, mango, these are the fleshy fruit or soft fruit which enclosed with seed, and dry fruit, the pericarp is not pulpy or enclosed by seed. In case of in pea pod of the pericarp, and in case of seed like walnut, hard shell, these are the dry fruit. Then function of the fruit. Fruit protect the seed from the unfavorable environmental condition. So the main nature of the fruit, it protect the seed. Fruit store the food inside the seed. So the fruits store the food for the seed inside them. Then fruits help in the dispersal of the seed present inside and facilitate their germination. The next class will start the seed. Okay, thank you.